Hi, I'm Albert Evans, and welcome to Show Talk, the series that gives you the story behind the Fifth Avenue stage productions. I'd like to begin with a question. Where do musicals come from? Of course, that's what little kids typically ask around the age of 3 or 4. Mommy, Daddy, where do musicals come from? But there's no easy answer. You might actually be better off just having the baby talk. Because ideas for musicals come from all sorts of places: books, movies, plays, biographies. But there are very few musicals based on interviews. I can only think of a couple of examples, most notably A Chorus Line and a near-forgotten show called Working. And the one, of course, that we're going to look at for the next few minutes, Come From Away. Come From Away is the brainchild of 2 Canadian writers, David Hein and Irene Sankoff. David is from Saskatchewan, and Irene is from the Toronto suburb of North York. They are both children of divorce who grew up with their moms and not a lot of money. David, as a kid, often went to the Winnipeg Folk Festival with his mother, and he developed a taste for Celtic folk rock bands like Great Big Sea, which is a sound that pervades Come From Away's score. Irene, by contrast, was a real musical theater nut who danced around the house and bonded with her mother over old Gene Kelly musicals. Irene and David met at York University in Toronto on the very first day of Frosh Week. There was an immediate spark. They dated, they worked together on school entertainments, and soon became a couple. They both loved theater, but they were musically divided. David was a singer-songwriter with a growing fan base. He played bars and clubs and often went out on tour as a band member and a soloist. In her heart, Irene was an aspiring actress. But she was also an academic overachiever who felt a lot of pressure from the science-focused side of her family. Though she acted in student plays at York, she graduated with a double major in psychology and creative writing. They were devoted to each other, but after graduation, their lives were filled with forces that kept them apart. Band gigs for David, temp jobs for Irene. Then one day they had an idea. A brilliant one, as it turned out. They decided that in order to spend more time together, they would write shows, collaborate, become a writing team. It was a career strategy and a relationship tool. This could have been a disaster, but they loved it. Soon David was as smitten with musical theater as Irene was. Their first major fight was about whether musical theater could change the world. David, the dreamer, trying to convince Irene, the realist, that yes, it could. Well, David didn't really win that argument, but Irene, on the verge of applying to do a master's in speech and language pathology, agreed to at least give writing and acting a try professionally. So, in 1999, Irene Sankoff and David Hein moved to New York City. Irene began studying at the legendary Actors Studio, and David began work as sort of assistant everything at a music studio where the Muppets recorded. At night, he sort of borrowed the Muppets' equipment to record his own songs. Irene and David lived in a residence called International House in Upper Manhattan, along with grad students from 110 countries. And that's where they were on September 11, 2001, when planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. That night, the scared students at International House shut the windows to keep the smell of smoke out, while Irene and David gathered them around the piano for an impromptu concert, a moving experience they would later draw on for Come From Away. But 9/11 had another impact on them. A month later, David woke up and said, "Hey, The world is falling apart. Why don't we get married? So, on October 12th, they headed down to City Hall and did the deed. Well, their years in New York were lean. They found work but didn't exactly thrive. Savings dwindled. The studio David was working at shut down, and Irene, who had an agent and was getting gigs, separated a shoulder in a dance class. Because they were uninsured in the States, they took a trip to Toronto so Irene could see a doctor, and that trip turned into a move back home. And so it went for years, pursuing art while paying bills. They were now homeowners with a mortgage and mounting expenses, but they barely got to see each other and grew lonely, especially when David was off on tour. Was this really the dream? Then in 2009, David's mother came out as a lesbian and married her partner, a practicing Wiccan, in a very unusual ceremony. And David wrote a funny little song about the wedding. But let's hear him tell about it.
So my mom recently married her partner, Jean. Yeah, that's pretty cool. And my mom is Jewish and Jean is Wiccan. And so they had a lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding. And I wrote a song about it. How could you not, right? My mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding was nice. Not your typical wedding, it was out in a field and nobody threw rice. I held the hooker and it was pretty good, and you should have seen my Uncle Larry get a look at my mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding was great. There was all kinds of food, and after the food there was cake. Me and my band played a couple of tunes, and my mom's jumped over a pot and a broom. True story. My mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding was fun. All the pictures are awesome, you couldn't have asked for more sun. Hands were tied fast and he smashed a glass, and it was one of the nicest weddings I'd been at. My mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding was cool. I even got to invite a couple of friends from school. The weddings can occasionally be a bit boring, but the place was jumping and no one was snoring. I'm currently working on a musical of this. My mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding rocked. They were married by a priestess and my mums wore matching frocks. Baruch Adonai, Eloheinu Shalom. I don't know any Wiccan, but here's to my mums and my mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding. You can bet me, but I bet you're wrong in the betting. There will never ever be the same kind of wedding than my mother's lesbian Jewish Wiccan wedding. Thank you.
That song became the most requested number in David's touring set. More than most of his work, it was influenced by the musical theater that Irene had introduced him to over the course of their relationship. And what if, he wondered, they could expand it into an actual musical, and at the very least spend some time together? Marrying their skills, Irene and David began trying to turn their family story into a fictional musical, at first a conventional book musical, where an invisible fourth wall separates the performers from the audience, and scenes and songs alternate to tell a story. But then Irene had an epiphany that led the pair to a different writing style, one they later refined with Come From Away. At the gym one day, Irene was talking with an enthusiastic friend about Wiccan Wedding, and the friend said, "You know, the best thing about it is that it's based on a true story." And a light bulb went on. Irene came home to David and said, "Okay, we've got to throw it all out, start again, let's tell the real story." The new version would eventually feature David sitting on a stool in his Glass Tiger t-shirt, singing songs about his mother and her new wife Jean, how he introduced them to Irene at a Hooters, and the history of same-sex marriage in Canada, using a troupe of actors, including Irene, to play multiple parts and tell the story. It was a sweet and direct show, and it became a hit at the Toronto Fringe Festival. then was picked up by big-time producer David Mirvish to play at the 700-seat Panasonic Theater that he had just purchased. Irene and David, now officially Sankoff and Hine, were launched in their career as commercial musical theater creators. They were very lucky in the people they met along the way. This is Michael Rubinoff, a Toronto lawyer and Associate Dean of Performing Arts at Sheridan College in the Toronto suburb of Oakville. As a result of My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding's success, Rubinoff approached David and Irene with an idea he had had for several years, a show based on Operation Yellow Ribbon. Now, Yellow Ribbon was the mission in which the residents of Gander, Newfoundland, housed 7,000 airline passengers who had been stranded at Gander Airport when North American airspace was shut down on 9/11. Rubinoff had been deeply touched by stories of Gander's humanity and kindness, and he began to wonder if these moments could be the foundation of a musical showcasing the best of Canadian values. In 2011, with the help of the Canadian government, he established the Canadian Music Theatre Project, described as Canada's incubator for new musical theatre works by Canadian and international artists. The Gander story could not have been a more ideal project for Irene and David. At International House, they had seen firsthand how frightened strangers from around the world bonded on 9/11 and how music played a role in bringing them together. And, most important, they had already found the right aesthetic for such a story, having learned from Wiccan Wedding that a musical could be a true story set in our times, told with plenty of direct address, and that authenticity, at least for them, was the key to winning over an audience. So, with Rubinoff's support and a $12,000 grant from the Canada Council, our team headed to Gander in 2011 for the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Many of the original stranded passengers and flight crew, the come-from-aways as the Ganderites called them, returned to reunite with the town that had so generously taken them in. Also descending on Gander were dozens of news teams from around the world, jockeying to get the Ganderites in front of their cameras. But Irene and David were there for a different reason. The news teams wanted sound bites. Irene and David wanted the whole story. They began by recording endless hours of interviews, and soon the locals started to invite them to put down their recording equipment and come home for dinner, stay overnight, you're family now. Well, their biggest challenge was convincing the Ganderites that they had done something worth writing about. You're writing a musical about people making sandwiches? Well, good luck with that. But of course the folks of Gander had done much more than make sandwiches, and that's the story you will see on the Fifth Avenue stage. David and Irene say that one inspiration for Come From Away was Fred Rogers, television's Mr. Rogers, and the story he often told about when he was a boy and would see scary things on the news. His mother would say to him, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." And that's the message David and Irene really wanted to get across. There's a great comfort in realizing that there are so many caring people in the world. Anyway, armed with all of these interviews, they wrote their first draft. And Rubinoff used that draft, now titled Come From Away, to produce a workshop version for his Canadian Music Theatre project in 2012. The workshop was sufficiently successful that Rubinoff invited Irene and David to finish writing it for a full production at Sheridan College as part of the college's 2013 theatrical season. The full production was an artistic success, but Rubinoff was unable to attract a Canadian producer for further development. In the meantime, Goodspeed Musicals in East Haddam, Connecticut, included the show in its workshop program, and buzz was beginning to build around Come From Away. In 2013, the National Alliance for Musical Theater selected it as a showcase production in their Festival of New Musicals in New York. Now, at this festival, you get just 45 minutes to present a cut-down staged reading of your show for interested producers, investors, and other showbiz insiders. And this is where the Seattle connection finally kicks in. Many of you know Kenny and Marlene Alhadeff, who have been so generous with their time and support to Seattle theater. Back in 2006, together with Randy Adams and Sue Frost, the Alhadeffs formed a partnership called Junkyard Dog Productions, the organization behind First Date and Memphis, both of which had been developed by the Fifth. Junkyard Dog brought the writers to Seattle for an intensive 3-week workshop period, 2 weeks at the Fifth to develop and refine the script and music, and 1 week at Seattle Rep to mount a workshop production. And there they added the choreographer, the music supervisor, and other back-of-the-house players to get the show on its feet. And they chose very well. All of those key players remained with the show. This was an intense and exciting time for all of us at the Fifth and at the Rep. Essentially, Come From Away went through about 6 months of development in 3 weeks. Come From Away went on to a record-breaking run at the La Jolla Playhouse in California, and then came back to Seattle for another huge success at Seattle Rep. From there, it went to Toronto in 2016, and finally opened on Broadway on March 12th, 2017. It was the sleeper hit of the season, garnering 7 Tony Award nominations and winning the trophy for Best Direction. And the Fifth Avenue was chosen to launch the acclaimed North American tour. Now, remember that argument that Irene and David had when they were young newlyweds about whether musical theater could change the world? Well, Irene finally came around to David's way of thinking. First, after meeting senior citizens who changed their minds on same-sex marriage after seeing My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding. And now, with Come From Away, receiving hundreds of letters from audience members about how it's inspired them to be better people. So if you don't want to be better people, well, I have warned you. The rest of you, thanks for watching this show talk, and I'll see you at the Fifth.